What are the major challenges facing policy professionals in state government leadership? Which skills are critical for success in policy and politics? Welcome to the School of Public Policy series spotlighting professionals with careers in public policy. Today, we invite you to join a conversation as we profile Pennsylvania House Speaker Bryan Cutler. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, with Catherine Baumgardner, our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Whitney. Great to be here today.
Serving his 8th term in the Pennsylvania General Assembly, Speaker Cutler represents the 100th Legislative District in Lancaster County. In June 2020, his colleagues elected him to serve as the 139th Speaker of the House after serving as the Majority Leader. He was re-elected Speaker on January 5th, 2021. Personal experience and an extensive background in hospital operations, administration, and law have translated into legislation to help increase efficiencies in the Commonwealth's hospitals. Welcome, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Whitney and Catherine. Looking forward to it.
Well, we're so thrilled to have you with us, but this is really an opportunity for our students and our guests to speak with Speaker Cutler about his career path and his experience. So we want to encourage your questions throughout the discussion. Please don't hesitate to use that Q&A or the chat throughout the discussion, and we will ask Speaker Cutler your questions at any point. So I guess, Mr. Speaker, I want to start off by asking you about that inspiration to pursue the position in politics. You have a background as an X-ray technologist, you worked in hospital administration, you practiced law. What was that motivation to run for office?
Well, for me personally, it was a motivation to give back to the community. For those who might be unfamiliar with my story, it actually started when I was much younger. Both my parents were diagnosed with a terminal illness, Lou Gehrig's disease, and I was 15 at the time that my mom got sick, and I have a younger sister who is 13. And I want to stress that we did not go through that experience alone. We had a great social safety net in our community, our friends and our neighbors. And because of that, my sister and I were still able to lead a somewhat normal life. And when I got out of high school after my father had passed away, I decided to go to X-ray school, which is actually where I met Catherine. She was my vice president at the time. And then I went from being a staff tech to being in radiology administration. And from there, I quit and went to law school full time and went back to being a staff tech on a per diem basis. And while I was in law school, I was starting to give back to the community. I'd served on the planning commission locally and really wanted to be engaged, because that's one of the blessings of being in a commonwealth is we as citizens have such an opportunity to be involved at a local level because so many decisions are made there. And I simply wanted to give back on a much broader level and had the opportunity to do that here in the State House.
Such a fascinating journey. So many layers of complexity there. But talk to us a little bit about your interest in advocacy and that journey to law school.
Sure.
You mentioned that we met each other when you were in X-ray tech school, and I saw that spark in you many, many years ago. So tell us a little bit about just what made you so sure about that journey.
Well, I'll be very honest, Catherine. At first, I wasn't sure. The interest in law actually started in 7th grade. My best friend and I, Andrew Oltmans, who is also now an attorney, we went and shadowed a assistant district attorney for the day, and we got to sit in on an attempted murder case. And we sat through that portion of the trial, and it really was just fascinating to me to watch the lawyers in the courtroom as they handled evidence and took care of questions and things. It really sparked an interest in that area. And because of my life circumstances, though, going to law school right away really and traditional college path really wasn't available. So I was also interested in the math and sciences, and my mom was also a nurse, as was my grandmother and my aunt. So we had a long family history of healthcare. So that's how I started that. And then once I got into radiology and then went back for my undergraduate degree in healthcare administration, dealing with all of the IT components and the arena related to all the privacy laws and HIPAA as they came in really kind of re-sparked that interest in pursuing a legal career. And at that time, I was married, but we didn't have any kids yet. And I figured it was an opportunity to go and pursue that if I was ever going to do it. So I went back to law school when I was 28. So I was a very non-traditional student, and certainly appreciated having that life experience and that variety of backgrounds in terms of the clinical background, the business background, and how that kind of all came together to help me while I was in law school. And it was just a great journey. I always joke I'm kind of like a guidance counselor's worst nightmare because I bounced around from profession to profession, but in a very different way. It kind of actually all made sense because you got the clinical background dealing with patients, you have the business background from an administrative standpoint, the IT background, which I still stay very engaged with even today, and then the legal background. So it really has been able to kind of shape a lot of the public policy that I get to work on because the General Assembly is full of people who come from a variety of different walks of life. But truthfully, there are very few people from healthcare in this profession. Out of 203 members in the House, there's exactly 4 of us that have any kind of lengthy hospital experience. There's myself, there's a former nurse, there's a paramedic who was also a hospital administrator, and a former nursing home administrator. And yet the process, if you will, of policymaking is very healthcare intensive, particularly right now during the COVID pandemic and as we manage through that. But in addition to that, it's one of the largest portions of our state budget. About 28% of the budget, which is 40% human services, 28% of that is actually related to Medicaid. So we deal with patient outcomes and costs all the time at the state level. So to have that perspective is very helpful, especially now. Obviously, I didn't know that when I started the journey, but it's one that's certainly quickly become invaluable.
We have a question, and I think you've just pretty much answered this here. Someone wanted you to share a little bit how your non-legal, non-political work experience prior to being elected has influenced your perspective on policy, or how others in the House have different work experience before being elected.
Yeah, it's interesting. Myself included, I had this misperception that the House and the Senate was full of lawyers. That's always kind of the stereotypical elected official past job. The truth is, between the House and the Senate, there's only about 35 individuals who are attorneys out of the 253 total. So there's 203 members of the House, 50 in the Senate. About 35 of us are attorneys or have a legal background. Not everybody's still a practicing attorney. However, the number one profession is actually small business owner. When you look at the disclosure sheets that are filed by many of my colleagues. And it's across that variety of backgrounds that you get a lot of the diversity in terms of both opinions and policies. One of the advantages, and I'll use the COVID-19 shutdown, if everybody remembers back in the early days of the executive action, the governor shut down and he declared certain businesses essential and non-essential. And I think we would all agree that became somewhat cumbersome to try to manage from an executive level. And having that practical real world experience before, for example, in the supply chain world, for example, they said that paper manufacturers were essential. Makes sense. I think we would all understand that. However, what they didn't declare equally essential was the timber industry itself that would provide the pulpwood to the paper mills. And so what you had happen in the timber industry. You had the same thing happen. Electric generation plants were essential, but yet coal mining was not. And they own, particularly in this world of just-in-time delivery, there's not a lot of stockpiles sitting around anymore. So having that real world experience, that's one example of where we were able to call the administration and say, well, it's great that you included this profession, but you have to also include their supply chains. And having that kind of background was very beneficial, and having that variety of backgrounds for all the members was equally beneficial. Another good one was grocery stores were allowed to be open, but farm stores such as like Tractor Supply were not, because they were considered retail, even though a lot of small farms or farmettes might depend on the animal feed that they get from there, or the supplies and medicines. So that was one that I actually personally called the governor about and said, I don't think that you've thought this out, because yes, you can find dog food at a grocery store, for example. However, they quickly ran out because they were the only place that was still open. So when I called the governor, he acknowledged and he had it fixed by the next morning. So having that kind of prior life experience is very important in this job. The other advantage, and I want to encourage everybody who's watching, and I do this almost everywhere that I talk. I just did it yesterday at a luncheon I was speaking at. Because of that varied background, it does cause some challenges. Only having 4 people who are familiar with some of the healthcare regulations that we deal with on a regular basis in the healthcare world means that you have to spend a lot of time educating the other members on what the problem is. So not only do you have to come up with a solution, you have to first convince folks that, yes, this is a problem. And then not only is there a problem, but that your solution is the best way to fix it going forward. And having that diversity of backgrounds is important for us as policymakers. I understand agriculture. I grew up in Lancaster County. I worked on a dairy farm. I understand healthcare because that's where the vast majority of my own life experiences have been. But as a legislator, I didn't understand the first thing about mining safety, for example. However, I'm expected to vote on mining safety laws. And that's certainly one of the advantages of this job, is that I'm able to call folks and say, hey, I don't understand your industry. Can I come see it? So I've been inside nuclear power plants. I've been inside hydro dams. I've been, underground in a coal mine. All these different life experiences and professions that I wouldn't otherwise get. But more importantly, I made contacts with people in those industries so that I can understand what the policy proposals that we would be working on actually would mean on the ground. So all the people who are listening to this, I'd really encourage them to make contact with their local state representative, their local state senator, say, hey, this is who I am. This is the line of work that I do, whatever that is. And if you ever have a question about it or you want to, come see it, feel free to reach out to me. Having that kind of access or having that kind of resource available when we're getting ready to consider something imminently is very valuable. And I know it's one that I've appreciated. Sometimes we'll use social media also. I have tweeted from committee members before, like I've been in a committee meeting and I might put out on Twitter or Facebook or, get an email about a topic and, you can reply and ask somebody right away, like, what's your opinion on this? How do you think this would work? So having access to those kinds of opinions is very beneficial in this job.
You brought up a great point because, our students are getting ready to go out there into the world, and they will be some of the individuals who will be coming to you with proposals, with, presentations about various issues. And I'm in a role like yours. Like you said, you're expected to know many different issues, and you can't possibly know everything. What are those major key things that they can do to make those issues stand out to you, or the key points stand out to you when they're presenting something to a lawmaker or someone on your staff?
Well, I'm going to start out with the big caveat of we're all different. When I first came at the age of 31, I was the 3rd youngest member of the caucus at that point, and there were people there that were multiple decades older than me. We just recently had one individual, for example, who retired 2 terms ago, so 4 years ago, that he still treated emails like letters. He would print off every email and he would make his notes on it in terms of a response, and then they would type up a response and then they would mail it. I'm probably a little bit more adept at technology. I use all of my own emails and return a lot of my own calls from the office. Not everybody's like that. So for me, what makes that difference or what makes that connection is, one, offering to be that resource and having the ability to contact somebody. The other is really that personal kind of contact. Don't form letters work, but if you can personalize it and say, I care about the nursing profession and patient safety, and this is why I support this bill. And then share a personal example or something. I think that would be very good. Because the truth is, while there are registered lobbyists in the building, they play a very important role in terms of representing individuals. Like the Farm Bureau, for example, has a lobbyist, that they represent all the farmers across the Commonwealth. Because many of the farmers may not have those connections with their local folks. So they have what I'll call a corporate representative, but then they also have individual representatives because they'll come to Harrisburg and do a lobby day. where they'll have a big luncheon, they'll stop in, they'll visit with all their legislators. All of those things are very important. Generally, there's kind of an unwritten rule where legislators will defer to the home legislator. Somebody from Altoona contacts me, I'll thank them for their input, but say, hey, you may also want to reach out to Representative Gregory or whoever is in that area and say, that's who you really should also talk to because they are your representative. And not because it's not important that they contact me, but it's important that they make that own local connection because it'll be far easier. That's one of the best things I think of the state house. The average district has about 65,000 people in it. And there's a better than average chance you're going to run into everybody at some point in the district, as you serve. I'm a big believer in if you do the job well, you never have to run for the job again. When you go to the grocery store or you go to a school board meeting or a supervisor's meeting or whatever gathering might be there, you're inevitably running into constituents. You might get a question. And having that level of personal advocacy is also very important, I think, because it's the direct connection. And that's really what the House is designed to be that direct input into government. That's why we have elections every 2 years in the House, because you get a very good turnover then. We've had over 90% turnover, and it's going to even go up this time since I came for the first time 15 years ago. I'm in the middle of my 8 2-year term, so I'm in year 15 and 16. And I'm already in the top 20 in seniority in the Republican caucus, out of 113 members. So there's only about a dozen people who have been there more than 16 years at this point. To contrast that with my first term, you had to be there more than 20 years to even be a chairman. And you had to be there and be a chairman before you could even run for leadership in many cases. So the idea that I was able to run for leadership at the end of my 4th term or my 8th year because of the high turnover really, I think, shows kind of the changing face of the legislature at this point.
Just to follow up, we did have a question about issue advocacy, making a difference in legislation, and asking, do you hear from issue advocates as well as registered lobbyists? And they ask for examples. So.
Yeah, the Farm Bureau is probably a good one. The timber industry, for example, has someone as well. Truthfully, almost every professional organization has some level of representation on a professional level in Harrisburg. Sometimes it's volunteer. There are many lobbyists who will take on volunteer clients because they care about the issues. Perhaps it's farmland preservation, for example, which is a subset of ag. Very important, but I know that we have a lobbyist who really had volunteered a lot of time on those issues as well. And I think it's important to hear from both because the professional lobbyists, it is their job to follow what bills are going into what committees and what amendments are being filed and what's happening legislatively. But it's equally, and I would argue probably even more important, aside from kind of the process discussion, just hearing from everyday people. That is the most important part of our job because that is what we are called to do is to go to the legislature and represent them and their interests. And what we have to recognize is, and I know that folks say that the legislature is very dysfunctional at times. And if you just followed the news, you probably would agree with that statement. The truth is, though, and I'll use my time as majority leader last session. I was majority leader for about 18 months of the 24. The last 5.5 or 6 months, I was speaker. And we passed 648 bills out of the House. Of those 648 bills, 220 made it to the governor's desk. Of those 220, unfortunately, we got a record number of vetoes. We had 22. To put that into perspective, in my prior dozen or more years, we'd only had 4 vetoes in total. So to have 22 in one session is monumentally high. However, the piece that stood out to me, and one of the reasons that I think the legislature sometimes gets a bad knock, is that 96% of those bills, of the 648, 96% had bipartisan support, meaning somebody from both sides voted for it. And more importantly, 64% of the time they were unanimous, which means everybody voted for it. And remember that time period also represents the last year of that session was during COVID. So it was probably what we would all agree is one of the most contentious political times in any of our lifetimes. And yet almost 2 out of every 3 times, we were still able to find agreement to address, veterans benefits, educational benefits for the family. We were the first in the country to allow for the transfer of GI benefits to family members. We did a farm bill. We did multiple healthcare bills related to managing the pandemic, whether it was aid to healthcare workers in hospitals and ambulances and fire and rescue, to actually dealing with scope of practice issues and making sure that people were able to get access to care, telemedicine, which we actually accomplished through a regulation waiver. We waived literally hundreds of waivers were issued during that time period so that people could get access to care and still be able to operate in a very changed manner. So sometimes it's the legislation that I think we should be focusing on. The truth is, a lot of times the media just reports on that 4% where we disagree along party lines, and I don't think that's a real representation of what actually happens in Harrisburg the majority of the time. And I'd love to see a focus on that, because more often than not, we not only agree, we actually all agree, and I think that is worth celebrating.
Well, I know Catherine has a question, but I'd like to encourage our guests to ask your questions in the chat or use the Q&A box, because we still have time, plenty of time for questions for our speaker, Bryan Cutler.
Bryan, you've piqued my interest in a couple of different areas. I listened to you with 16 years of experience now and navigating very important leadership roles within the legislature. What was it like 16 years ago being a freshman senator or representative walking into this new role? How were you oriented? How did you learn how to navigate? And what was the role that mentoring played for you in that process to make you so successful today?
Well, thank you, Catherine. The truth is, mentoring played a very big role. And that's actually one of my concerns over the last 2 sessions with the impact of the COVID pandemic, because many of the new freshmen didn't get the same experience that I did when I came 8 terms ago. My first term, you come in, it's first of all, it's a whirlwind. You essentially win on election day in November, and by December the 1st, you are engaged and you're voting for leadership positions with people that you don't even really know in a lot of times. And in my case, Representative Jerry Stern, who was out from the Altoona area, out in Blair County, he was my mentor when I first came. And he gave one piece of advice, which I thought was, at the time, I didn't realize how wise it was. He said, if you always worry about how people, might get upset over how you vote, you'll never make decisions. He said, you need to understand that every time you vote, you upset 10% of the people. Get through your first 10 votes, realize everybody's been mad at some point, and just do your job. And I think that in hindsight, that's been great advice, because you can't always worry about what people might think. You have to do what's right. So, and sometimes that means taking unpopular positions in terms of what the Constitution says or what the law says. And so mentoring was very important. But in terms of our orientation, one of the things that I really enjoyed was the first couple weeks is actually very bipartisan. The Republican and Democrat new members would all get together. We refer to every incoming election cycle as a class. And oftentimes, particularly about the first 6 months or so of the legislative cycle, so it'd be from January to June, the first 6 months, everybody wants to meet the new members. And in my class, we had 50 new members. So almost a quarter of the body was new. And what we would do was on Monday night after session, there might be, an ag reception. So all of the Republicans and Democrats would go together at 5 o'clock to the ag reception. And then maybe the next one was one for the coal industry. So then you go to the coal industry. And the next one might be for healthcare workers and nurses. So then you would go to that one. So by default, what happened was you were spending hours together as a class after session. So you got to know people as people and their families. As a matter of fact, if you go onto my website, even to this day, or stop in and see me in my office, you would see the picture of the judge who swore me in. And it's Judge Newman, who was a Democrat from Washington County, who I sat next to for 2 terms on the floor. And he and I became very good friends. He's been to my house. He's had dinner with my family and vice versa. I actually got an award one time for ALS advocacy in Pittsburgh, and he surprised me and showed up at the reception. And those kinds of friendships are invaluable. And I do need to give a shout out because I'm watching the chat here. I see that Lauren Pile's on. Jeff, Lauren, your dad is an amazing man. I shared an office with Jeff for 6 years. We were office suite mates. And so thank you for being here. And thank you. And Jeff unfortunately had to retire. And he gave one of my nomination speeches when I ran for speaker the first time. So, you make wonderful friends on both sides of the aisle. And it is sometimes admittedly, it's a challenge because what has happened now is with COVID, all of those social events haven't occurred. So people, and we allow remote participation just like we're doing today on the House floor. We changed our rules so that you could vote remotely. So when you lose that personal contact and that personal connection, sometimes it makes it a little harder to serve. In my opinion, it makes it a little bit harder to serve and make those compromises or even know who to go to, because you don't know that, I'll use myself as an example. There's another representative who I won't name because I didn't talk to him, but his father right now has ALS. So he knew my story by virtue of me talking at one of the advocacy days. So he immediately reached out to me when his dad was sick. So, we've worked together on issues, and I know that Representative Pyle, worked on cancer awareness, and that was very important. And so like you get to know what everybody's main issues are. So you end up becoming essentially like an air traffic controller. Like I had a member who unfortunately was abused as a child, and he wanted to do some legislation on that. And as speaker, I meet with all the new freshman members. So when I met with one of the new freshmen who said his number one advocacy issue was working on victims of child abuse, I immediately said, well, do you mind if I talk to another representative who is also interested in this? And, they've worked collaboratively, Republican and Democrat, from either end of the state, East and West. They've worked collaboratively on that since then, and they've been successful. And, missing out on that personal kind of orientation, I think could have long-term impacts on the legislature. So it's my hope that as we get back to normal, that we can kind of restore some of those relationships, because quite frankly, that's what solves problems.
Well, speaking of Lauren, we've had a flurry of questions come in, including the one from Lauren Pyle, Jeff's daughter. And she's thanking you for stopping by. She said, 203 members is a lot of members. What made you stand out over the years to now be Speaker of the House? How can young professionals embody that in their careers?
Great question, Lauren. Your dad would say that I didn't know how to sit down and be quiet. Probably. No, in all seriousness, because of my legal background, I very quickly became interested in the rules of procedure on the House floor. And John Marr, who was a representative from out in the Pittsburgh area, was kind of our rules guru when I first started, and I was amazed at everything he knew. And Lyndon B. Johnson actually had a quote that I think is very true, and it was this. He said, it doesn't matter if you have the votes or not for an issue, because if I write the rules, I always win. And it really kind of embodied to me the power of understanding the procedure of how to do things, because everything is very arcane in terms of the approach, in terms of drafting amendments, in terms of, understanding when it's proper to raise an issue, or, on what part of consideration, first, second, or third, do you offer an amendment. So for me, I quickly learned the rules. And despite my job, I actually don't like public speaking. And I know that I'd shared that publicly many times before. I always thank my 12th grade teacher, Miss Pasco, who got me over my fear of public speaking, and was very appreciative of everything that she taught me. But the nice thing about the House floor is once you get to know everybody, it doesn't feel like you're addressing potentially thousands of people, because it's all broadcast. And oftentimes the former former legal counsel and then ultimately chief of staff to the then majority leader, would simply come back and say, hey, I need you to talk on this issue on 10 minutes, and she'd drop a packet of papers on my desk. Now I have a couple blessings. One of them is a photographic memory, so I could quickly read through something and get a pretty quick grasp of it. And so I started leading rules debate and floor debate even as a freshman. And a sophomore, I would start engaging on interrogations on the House floor. And ultimately, it was my colleagues who, by virtue of doing that on a consistent basis, I'm very much a civil libertarian. I would argue a lot of times on unconstitutional search and seizures or unconstitutional wiretaps or invasions of privacy. And those are issues that transcend political differences. R's and D's are both concerned about those. So as I kind of did that, I had a lot of our own members say, you really ought to consider running for House leadership, because that's you win the election to get there in your district, but then to get into leadership, you have to win a caucus election of everybody else who also won elections in their districts. So as I kind of dove into the issues and got the encouragement from my colleagues, that's ultimately what I did. Was I decided I was going to run for policy, which is really kind of the policy wonk or nerd position, because I'm very interested in fixing problems. And I had enough people say, well, we think you should run for whip instead, because you're already engaging in leading the floor debate. You should just do that job full time. And then I was whip for 2 terms, became leader for 1, and then transitioned near the end of that to be speaker. And it's been a wonderful journey. It's certainly not where I saw myself professionally at any point. I figured I was going back in-house with a hospital at some point. And it really just happened organically by doing the job I had. I never had to worry about what job was next. And that would probably be my advice to you, Lauren, is as young professionals, just, do whatever tasks that you've been asked to do and go above and beyond that. And then that will get you noticed and people will naturally promote you. Quite frankly, that's how I got picked for radiology administration. Wilma, my former director, grabbed me one day because she heard that I was thinking about moving to a different department. And she says, I don't want you to move yet. I want you to come talk to me before you do. And, ultimately, she hired me to be the manager of support services. And, I still stayed in contact with her well after I left the hospital as well. So it was, it's always good. It's always good to kind of have other people notice that. And, I look for that in my own life. I look for that in my own folks, because it's easy to identify people who excel and people who want to achieve greatness. So I just think it's a great opportunity. And I just think it's one that professionally, it doesn't matter what field you're in, that you can certainly apply to your life. And one, you'll get noticed, and 2, you'll be surprised at what else you're asked to do, I think.
Well, following up on that, we have a question here about any tips or advice for those who are about to graduate as an undergrad and looking to pursue a career or experience within the public sector without having a degree in political science / law.
That's actually what we need more of. I'm amazed at the number of folks who come into the poli-sci world with other degree paths. We've got English majors. We've got a wide variety of backgrounds, which is what makes us so unique, I think. And I think that, for anybody who's looking for those kinds of connections, there's nothing wrong with a political science degree, but don't feel like that precludes you from coming into the policy world, because we have former teachers, we have, we've got a whole host of things. Because what a lot of folks may not recognize is we have 26 different committees in the House. So we've got the Health Committee, we've got the Human Services Committee, we've got the Finance Committee, we've got the Appropriations Committee, which does the budget. You have all these different specialty sub areas that, you might have an expertise in that. So you could come in and work on tax policy on the Finance Committee with a financial background, but you may not have any kind of poli-sci or, pre-law background. And, we have lawyers, we have people with political science backgrounds, and they're also important. But don't let not having that experience preclude you from doing that. Because I think that it's important to get that variety of viewpoints. That's something that I always try to do as majority leader. And one of the things that I was blessed, I had a wonderful team in my office. And, we had a couple of things. One, I never hired yes people. I wanted people to challenge me. And that was very important, because if I was about to make a mistake, I needed somebody to tell me. And we were able to run that calendar and get those kinds of production numbers because people would be honest. And, that's kind of success. You just don't stumble into it in terms of, getting, vast agreement across a broad political spectrum as well as issue spectrum. But it was my team, my chief of staff, and my researchers and my press folks and everybody who was there. Was one, they were committed to what our vision was, which was improving the Commonwealth. Two, they were committed to even challenging me if they felt that I was about to make some kind of mistake on a policy issue. And finally, we were able to brainstorm together in a way, because there was no judgment and there was no like, well, that's a silly idea, we'll never do it. We would take every idea that came onto the table. And by having that ability, we were able to solve problems in ways that people never anticipated. And that's something that I think that we all could be better served, in terms of our own lives professionally, because you need to be challenged, in my opinion, in order to better understand what you yourself believe.
We have some more questions that
Sure.
I do not want to ignore. And this is one that I had as well. So I'm excited that this came up. We have a lot of faculty and students who conduct a lot of policy research, and some of them will be continuing into their careers working on policy research for folks such as you and presenting proposals to you. What's your advice on how to make that research more relevant to you and how to help make a major impact?
A couple of things. One, start with what I opened with, which is make contact with your local state representative or state senator, because some of our best referrals actually have come from people in the district. They'll say, hey, I have a constituent, they're going to school for this, and, would you take a look at their resume? Most jobs, even in this interconnected IT kind of world, are still personal contacts on some level. So one, make that connection at a personal level. Two, we constantly post jobs. So don't be shy. Make sure that you apply. If you can, get, somebody to give you a reference who's inside, that also helps, because, they're going to know what jobs are coming up, because maybe their office mate just quit, and, they know that there's a position on a committee or something like that, and you can get advanced notice of that. And
sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, Whitney.
I was going to say, if they're working on research, if we're looking at faculty or students who are already in the research arena, what might be helpful to a lawmaker such as yourself, as far as to help make the research more accessible, more relevant, and easier for you to take as you're going about trying to implement policy?
Part of that actually is just reaching out and saying, hey, I did this study on this particular issue and how it impacts people. There was it was a public health study in Baltimore. They noticed through geolocation that individuals in a certain area of the city had a higher rate of asthma than what was statistically expected. So, there was a case where they identified geographically an area, and it turned out that was the area that all the buses went to, and they would idle in between routes. So, the pollution from diesel fumes and exhaust, they assumed is what was leading to that. So they reached out to their local policymakers and simply said, hey, we noticed this anomaly. Two, we think we know the cause, and they were able to fix that problem. So, I would just not be shy. I would reach out and say, hey, if this is an area of interest or an area of expertise, absolutely share that, because sometimes in the House, generally everybody agrees on what the problem is. Everybody wants schools to be successful. For example, everybody wants kids to get caught up after the disruptions from COVID over the last 2 years. But where the disagreement may come is, how do you fix that problem? Some folks will say, let's put more money into the system. Some folks will say, well, let's change the system because maybe they needed some extra tutoring. Maybe they need summer school. Maybe they need access to additional services that actually aren't related to education. Just like we have social determinants of health, there's also social determinant impacts in education. And if a kid's hungry, or if they've got dental problems and they've got tooth pain, they're not going to pay attention or do well in school. So you've got to identify what's the root cause of some of these issues, and then identify it and then address it where you find it, as opposed to simply saying, well, the school's struggling because these kids aren't getting the grades that they're supposed to, or they're not advancing in a way that we would expect. So in that world, if you're doing research on education and what kids are doing, absolutely share it, because I think everybody recognizes that there have been challenges post-COVID. We saw the test results come out a couple of weeks ago that were substantially delayed. And to be clear, I'm not a big fan of standardized testing. I myself am not a good test taker. And despite that, that is the system that we currently have in place. So whether we like the results or not, we need to look at them and try to learn from them. And in this particular case, the proficiency of our students as they were tested this time went down. I don't think anybody was surprised by that because you had a lot of physical disruptions for class, and you had a lot of, we're online and then you're in person and then you're canceled altogether. And it was this wide variety of impacts. But now that we've identified the problem, how do you fix it? What do they need? And I think it's going to be different, because what they need in Potter County is going to be very different than what they might need in Center City, Pittsburgh, or Philly in terms of the level of resources. So I think there's going to have to be some flexibility in what those answers look like, because the local school boards are going to be best situated to understand what their students need. And, they need to engage the superintendent, they need to engage the teachers. And I think they're going to be able to do that in a much more efficient way than a department out of Harrisburg.
That's a great point. And we have a question here that's a good follow-up for that, especially as you're, trying to work in a nonpartisan manner. How do you balance your own personal opinion and the opinion of your constituents when you're presiding over the house and managing the House and trying to do so in a nonpartisan manner?
Well, it's a great question, actually, because as speaker, you really are nonpartisan. And for me, it's kind of easy, and I'll put my lawyer hat on for a minute. The rules are pretty plain. There's a couple rules that, quite frankly, I would not have written the way that they are written. But at the beginning of every session, I'll give some background. At the beginning of every session, the leaders, majority and minority leader, get together and they work on the rules, whatever they're going to be. This is how we offer amendments. This is when we can offer amendments. This is what time of the day we're going to start. This is how committees are going to operate. This is how many people are in committees. And there are some things, and the rules change every session. I made a lot of changes myself when I was in my leader position. And sometimes you test drive it and you say, okay, does this work? We created a new committee called the Government Oversight Committee, and everybody was very worried about it. They said, well, we don't want them snooping around. We already have the Health Committee. Why do we need an oversight committee of the Health Committee? And truth is, it actually worked really well. They had subpoena power. They were able to look at some problems that we encountered. It's a bipartisan committee. And they were able to take testimony and offer solutions. And Chairman Seth Grove ran that the first term, and he was a great pick for that because he really dove into it, and he has a very analytical mind. And that really led to him working on a lot of other legislation that we're still working on even this term. So in that world, if you will, of that interaction, it is important to kind of get those inputs. And I just think that that's really important. And, in terms of being nonpartisan, the rules are what they are. And I even told the leaders that one time from the rostrum. I said, look, like I'm enforcing the rule as you wrote it, not, because the lawyer says you interpret the words this way. If you don't like it, we can rewrite the rule. I mean, we have that power with the 102 members of the House. We can amend the rules and change it. So that's the first piece. The rules are kind of easy. Where you get into my personal views versus those of the district, I can give one that's unrelated to healthcare or public policy, really, and that's on Sunday hunting. We had a statutory prohibition on Sunday hunting. I will tell you that me and my family hunt. And I would have, on a personal level, I would love the idea to be able to go out and hunt after church on Sundays, because otherwise I don't I don't get to spend a lot of time with my kids by virtue of the hours on this job in terms of, hunting happens during the daytime. Most of my days start at 4 a.m. Like last night, I ended at 11. And yesterday, I actually started early. I started at 3 a.m. yesterday. So I went to about 11 o'clock last night. And, that's a pretty normal day. So I don't get a lot of free time to hunt with my wife and my kids. So on a personal level, I would like it. The district overwhelmingly against it. So in that particular case, I was a no vote because it's my job to represent the interests of the district, not what I wanted on a personal level. And it's interesting. It's interesting sometimes because that happens more than you would think. My friend Judge Newman, who sworn me in twice as speaker, and that I mentioned earlier, he really summed it up, I think, the best. He said sometimes people pick you to be their delegate. In other words, you go there and you make decisions on their behalf. They trust you to take whatever information you get and then make an informed decision on that position. He said other times they send you here simply to represent what they want. And that's the difference. Sometimes you have to recognize the two. And on the Sunday hunting piece, that it was my job to represent what they wanted, not that I was delegated to make that decision on their behalf.
You talked a little bit about this, but I want to follow up with this question from one of our attendees. You spoke about interacting with people in the district to get perspectives before you vote on a program or policy. And you did just talk a little bit about this, but what about after the program or policy has been executed and the feedback you get from individuals involved with the implementation and execution? This new state-based exchange comes to mind, and whether that is something that may be continually refined from a statutory perspective now that the Commonwealth has been operating it for a few years.
Sure. Great question. And I promise this wasn't a setup. Whoever asked that question, I actually was the one who sponsored the legislation to begin the state-based exchange. It was one of those weird examples where we had unanimous agreement in between House Republicans and Democrats, but more importantly, Governor Wolf and President Trump in terms of what we wanted to do. And I know that those two political universes rarely collide. But the truth is that was an area where everybody recognized the value in that. And it turns out that we were correct in many of those assumptions, because last year, the actual cost of insurance on the state-based exchange was reduced by 5.5%. It wasn't a 5.5% reduction of a 20% projected increase. It was an actual year-over-year reduction of 5.5%. And that was actually above their estimates. They thought they could get 3 to 5% last year, so they were able to get a little bit more. I think that we'll be able to keep those savings up as we go forward. Obviously, nationally, the inflation is going to be a challenge now, just because it's at decades highs. But the actual connecting of people to insurance products that provide services and that are less expensive comparatively was a good goal that everybody could agree on. And yes, we do. I actually just met with the insurance commissioner probably about 2 months ago. We were talking about some changes because not everything, quite honestly, needs a legislative change. Sometimes they already have the authority and they just need to make a regulatory change. And that the regulatory process is very different than the legislative process. Some would actually argue that it's more difficult than the legislative process just because of the time periods that are in it. Legislatively, we need 4 days in the House, and one of those days is by rule. We have a 24-hour cooling off period, if you will, for amendments. But constitutionally, you have to have 3 days in each chamber. So that's 7 days between the House and the Senate. And then the governor gets 10 days to either sign, veto, or let become law an item. So you can get a bill done in 17 days. The comment period is open longer than that for any time you're doing regulations. And so that's important, kind of recognize the difference of the two. But sometimes we don't have to actually do bills to get some of the policy changes that we need. That is something that we have discussed in terms of what does that look like? What does the reinsurance program look like? Because quite frankly, that's where we saved all the money, was the federal waiver that we got from the Trump administration to reinsure some of the more high cost catastrophic health claims that would be on the exchange. And by doing that, we were able to control the costs for everyone. And I think that's a good example of something that the state was able to do better than the federal government, because we also just had straight up administrative savings on top of that. And then we use those administrative savings to fund the reinsurance program. So we stack savings on savings, and that's why it's been successful. But we also have routinely, particularly once I became a leader, we routinely would put into the legislation, anytime that we would make a change, we want to see a report 6 months or a year out. We changed this program. What does that mean? And it used to be that once you did a bill in a particular subject area, sometimes it was taboo to touch it again for many sessions because an agreement was made and that's where you were at. That is no longer the case. Whether it's, pick a policy area, we have repeatedly went into certain areas and year after year or session after session updated it to make it better. The health exchange will likely be one of them as we go forward.
Bryan, you have so many things spinning. You have so many priorities. You have so many people wanting to come to you. You have so much information to gather. You obviously have a great staff around you.
I do.
So
invaluable.
Talk to us a little bit about your staff, and what if some of our students in this group might say, I'd like to know what it takes to become a staffer to someone like you. What's the process? What do you look for? What are things you want to see?
Yeah, we recently professionalized our human resources department on the House side. Each caucus runs their own. So Republicans, Democrats, House and Senate. So four different areas. And we made a lot of changes in terms of our hiring processes and our evaluations when I was a majority leader, because the majority leader actually has control over the hiring of the caucus. So we really streamlined and reconfigured many of the departments and their job duties, because we recognized, just like laws sometimes aren't updated the way they should be, many of our job descriptions weren't either. Something just became somebody's job by virtue of the fact that that's what they always did. So there's really kind of 2 or 3 different buckets of folks. You've got research people, you've got administrative support people, and then you've got leadership positions in the caucus. You have a head of research, you've got chief of staff to the speaker, for example, or the majority leader. You've got administrative kind of jobs, and that's big A administrative, because you are responsible. For example, I had an attorney friend of mine. We became friends after I hired him. But Jeremy ran my calendar for the legislation. That's important because constitutionally you have to post bills on certain days. You have to notice them for amendment. You have to tell the public when you're going to vote on them. So he was very detail oriented and ran tons of spreadsheets and lists. So he was great for that job. And he started out as a district office employee for another member who did constituent service. People would come in, they'd say, hey, I have a problem with a pothole or my driver's license or a DEP permit. And then he went from there to the finance committee, where he was a staffer and then the executive director. And then I hired him into the leader's office to help run the calendar, because I noticed how he ran the financial committee and that area. So there's lots of different paths. And he's got one that, quite frankly, yes, he's a lawyer, but other than that, there's not a lot of government training there. A lot of it was just him applying his own life skills to the job. My press person is Mike Straub, who used to work for WGAL. So a lot of folks may have seen him. He had worked for me at one point in the caucus, and then he left to go back to WGAL, and then I brought him back. But he's great because he understands all of the press issues, and has a wealth of connections there from his prior employment. And my chief of staff, our paths, we first met in 6th grade, which is kind of neat to be able to work with somebody that I've known that long. And then he went to college and ultimately got a master's in public administration and worked for government. He worked in the House and the Senate. I think he's worked in the House 3 times, and he's worked in the Senate twice. And, he was chief of staff for the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. And then he came over and did special projects for the Speaker in the House. And then I ultimately hired him as my chief of staff when I was leader, and now he's chief of staff in the Speaker's office. So, we have very different backgrounds, but, he went into government. And then when I got to government many years later, we reconnected. So there's lots of very exciting paths in terms of how we can get involved in government on a personal level. And I just think the best thing that you can say is don't be afraid to apply. Don't be afraid to go outside your comfort zone, because you most definitely will find, some unique rewards, I think, in serving in this way.
We've so beautifully punctuated the power of building relationships and networks, as well as accepting the crooked path that many of us follow throughout our lives.
It's a good description. There's a lot of crooks and turns.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, we have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask you any final words of advice for our students who are thinking about pursuing a similar role in politics or maybe a position working with the state government?
Well, one, we always need good people, so I'd encourage them to definitely get involved. And two, one of the things that I encountered very early on, and thankfully I didn't encounter this out in the private sector, but it was kind of ironic that I did once I hit the public sector, was never let somebody tell you that you're too young to do something. I heard all the time, I said, oh, I'm going to run for state house. They're like, well, aren't you a little young? Like, why don't you wait your turn? You'd hear stuff like that. I think, first of all, I think everything happens on God's time, not mine. So, there's a big component there of, if it's meant to be, it's going to happen. But don't be afraid, or don't use that as an excuse as to why not to get engaged somewhere. You can help people in so many ways. You don't have to run for office to be engaged in public service. You can come work in the staff position. You can, work on literally the front lines in terms of constituent service. I have some of the best people in my district office that just deal with people's governmental problems every day. And one, it's sad that they have to do that in the first place. I would just wish government would simply work. But the vast majority of our job happens when somebody in an executive agency somewhere doesn't return a call. It could be a medical license issue. Like we had one where somebody literally was going across the hallway from one practice to another at a medical office building, and they couldn't practice because their license wasn't transferred to the new practice. And it was weeks before that happened. That shouldn't be the case. It should be much easier to do that. And yet they reached out to us, and the staff was able to help do that. So if you want a very rewarding and fulfilling job, that's the kinds of impacts that you can have. You can help people when they come in, because when they come in, whatever their issue is, that is the most important issue for them at that time. It could be that they can't, maybe their driver's license has an issue, maybe their car has an issue, whatever it is. And with the registration, you can fix it, and you can really make a difference. And I just encourage people to do that. Be willing to make a difference, be willing to help people, and the world will be a much better place.
Great advice. Thank you so much to our guest, Pennsylvania House Speaker Bryan Cutler, and thank you for all of your questions. We hope that you'll join us for the next conversation in the Policy Profile series on Wednesday, April 13th at 11:30 a.m. when Project Manager, Entrepreneur, and Program Manager Mike Hannon joins us to discuss his career and work with the Presidential Management Program. I'm Whitney Sheridan with Catherine Baumgartner. For all of us with the School of Public Policy, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It was great to have you with us.
Thank you, Whitney. I enjoyed it.
Oh, amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, it was such a thrill to have you here.